This is the stage where things begin getting very real. Up until now, much of what he has felt has been driven by questions. Questions about you, questions about your life, questions about whether you have truly moved on. But now, something changes. The focus shifts. Instead of looking only at you, he begins looking at everything else. And that's when comparison begins. Comparison is powerful because it removes assumptions. It replaces imagination with reality, and reality has a way of exposing things people didn't see before. At first, the comparisons happen naturally, without effort, without planning, without intention. He may be talking to someone new, meeting new people, living his normal life, and suddenly, a thought appears, a small one, an unexpected one. She would have understood this, or she used to do that, or that reminds me of her. These moments seem insignificant, but they matter, because they are signs that his mind is beginning to measure experiences against memories. And memories often become clearer with distance. When people are present every day, their value can become familiar, and familiarity sometimes hides appreciation. Not because the value isn't there, but because people stop noticing what has become normal. Then the person is gone, and suddenly what felt ordinary starts looking extraordinary, not because it changed, but because perspective changed. That is what happens during this stage. He starts remembering details, the little things, the things that never seemed important at the time. Your patience, your encouragement, your loyalty, your ability to listen, the way you remembered small details, the way you cared, the way you made him feel understood, the way you supported him during difficult moments. Things he once accepted as normal now feel different, because now they are missing. And absence has a strange ability to highlight value. Many people don't fully understand the importance of something until they experience life without it. Not because they are careless, but because human beings naturally adapt to what they have. They stop noticing certain blessings because those blessings become part of everyday life. Then one day, those blessings disappear, and that's when awareness arrives. Slowly, quietly, sometimes painfully. For a man watching you move on peacefully, this stage can feel confusing, because he is no longer just noticing your absence. He is noticing your uniqueness, the qualities that made you different, the qualities he may have underestimated, the qualities he may have assumed would always be available. And that realization can create emotional tension, because it forces him to confront a difficult possibility. The possibility that what he lost cannot simply be replaced. This doesn't mean you're perfect. Nobody is. And it doesn't mean he never had problems with the relationship. Every relationship has challenges. But distance often reveals something important. It reveals the difference between temporary frustrations and lasting value. And sometimes people confuse the two. Sometimes they focus so much on the frustrations that they forget to appreciate the value, until the value is gone. That is where many men find themselves during this stage. Looking back, reassessing, reevaluating, trying to understand what they had, trying to understand what they lost, trying to understand why your absence still feels noticeable. And as they reflect, another realization begins emerging. You weren't just part of their routine. You were part of their emotional world. There is a difference. Routines can be replaced. Emotional connections are more complicated. Because emotional connections leave fingerprints on memory. They become tied to experiences, dreams, conversations, milestones, comfort, growth, support. And when those fingerprints remain, comparison becomes inevitable. A new conversation reminds him of an old conversation. A new experience reminds him of an old experience. A new connection reminds him of an old connection. And each comparison teaches him something. Not necessarily that the past was perfect, but that the past mattered, more than he realized, more than he admitted, more than he expected. This is often the stage where people begin experiencing genuine regret for the first time. Not full regret, not yet, but the beginning of it. Because regret requires awareness, and awareness is finally growing. Awareness of your value, awareness of your impact, awareness of your absence. Awareness of what life feels like without your presence. For a long time, he may have assumed life would simply continue unchanged, that everything would feel the same, that moving on would be simple, that forgetting would happen naturally. But now he sees something different. He sees that some people leave impressions that don't disappear quickly, and your peaceful moving on makes that impression even stronger, because there is no drama distracting from the truth, no chaos, no conflict, no emotional battles, just reality, and reality is becoming impossible to ignore. The reality that you are growing, the reality that you are healing, the reality that you are becoming someone who no longer revolves around the past. That reality creates pressure, not from you, not from anything you say, but from time itself. Because every day that passes makes one thing increasingly clear. You are moving farther away from the version of yourself that once waited for him. And that realization begins triggering something deeper, something heavier, something more emotional than curiosity, more emotional than comparison. The first true signs of regret. Because once a man clearly sees your value, and clearly sees your growth, and clearly sees that you may never belong to his future again, he begins asking a question that can no longer be avoided. What if I didn't fully appreciate her when I had the chance? And that question changes everything. Because questions about you slowly become questions about himself. Questions about his choices, questions about his actions, questions about opportunities that may never return. And that is where the next stage begins. A stage that often arrives quietly, but leaves a lasting impact. Because this is the stage where regret starts showing up. Not all at once, but one realization at a time. Regret rarely arrives with an announcement. It doesn't knock on the door and introduce itself. It doesn't appear all at once. Instead, it enters quietly. One thought at a time, one memory at a time, one realization at a time. And that's exactly why it can be so powerful. Because by the time someone notices it, it has often been growing for weeks or even months.
This is where many men find themselves after watching a woman move on peacefully.
Not shocked anymore. Not simply curious anymore. Not just comparing anymore. Now they are beginning to reflect. Honestly, deeply, and sometimes uncomfortably. Because reflection has a way of uncovering things the ego tried to hide. Things that were easier to ignore in the beginning. Things that felt less important when emotions were running high. But now the noise is gone. The relationship is over. The dust has settled. Life has become quieter. And in that quietness, the truth becomes easier to hear. He starts replaying moments, not the dramatic moments, not always the arguments, not always the breakup itself. Often it's the small moments, the ordinary moments, the moments he once took for granted. The way you checked on him, the way you supported him, the way you celebrated his victories, the way you stood beside him during difficult seasons, the way you cared when nobody else noticed. These memories begin resurfacing because the mind naturally revisits meaningful experiences when trying to understand loss. And that's what this stage is really about. Understanding loss. Not the loss of a relationship status, not the loss of routine, the loss of a person who mattered, a person who brought something unique into his life, a person who can no longer be assumed to be there. That realization becomes heavier over time, because unlike curiosity, regret involves responsibility. Curiosity asks, what happened? Regret asks, what could I have done differently? And that question is much harder to answer, because it requires honesty. Real honesty. The kind that cannot hide behind excuses. The kind that cannot blame circumstances. The kind that cannot point fingers forever. At some point, many men begin looking at their own choices, their own actions, their own decisions, and for some that process is uncomfortable. Because nobody enjoys confronting missed opportunities. Nobody enjoys realizing they may have underestimated something valuable. Nobody enjoys wondering whether they could have handled things better. Yet those thoughts appear anyway, usually at unexpected times, late at night, during quiet moments, while driving, while sitting alone, when distractions disappear and reflection becomes unavoidable. That is when the questions become deeper. What if I had communicated better? What if I had appreciated her more? What if I had been more present? What if I had fought harder? Notice how different these questions are from the questions in earlier stages. Earlier he was focused on you. Now he is focused on himself. That shift matters, because personal reflection is often where genuine regret begins. Not because it guarantees reconciliation, not because it guarantees action, but because it changes perspective. Suddenly the story is no longer just about what happened. It's about what could have happened. And human beings often struggle with possibilities left unexplored, especially when those possibilities involve someone they now see differently, someone they now appreciate differently, someone whose value has become clearer with time. Your peaceful moving on plays a major role here, because your peace removes distractions. If there had been endless drama, endless conflict, endless emotional chaos, he could focus on those things instead. He could blame the situation. He could blame circumstances. He could blame the conflict itself. But peace leaves very little to argue with. Peace simply exists. And because it exists, it forces attention toward reality. The reality that you are healing. the reality that you are growing, the reality that you are becoming stronger, the reality that life is carrying you forward. Every sign of your growth reinforces the same message. You are not standing still. And that's when regret becomes heavier. Because regret becomes most painful when people realize time is moving, that opportunities are changing, that doors do not stay open forever, that people evolve, that lives continue. And for the first time, he begins sensing something he tried not to think about before. The possibility that he may not get another chance. Not necessarily a relationship chance, but a chance to experience the version of you that once loved him so deeply. Because that version of you is changing. Healing changes people. Growth changes people. Moving forward changes people. And the more he sees that transformation, the more real it becomes. You are no longer waiting in the same emotional place. You are no longer frozen in the same chapter. You are writing new pages. And he can see it. Even if he never says it. Even if he never admits it. Even if he tries to convince himself otherwise. He can see it. And seeing it creates a feeling he cannot easily escape. A feeling that grows whenever he remembers the past. Whenever he notices your progress. Whenever he realizes how much has changed. That feeling is regret. Not loud regret. Not dramatic regret. Quiet regret. The kind that sits in the background. The kind that follows into ordinary moments. The kind that appears unexpectedly when they least expect it. And unlike curiosity, regret has weight. Because curiosity wonders. Regret feels. Curiosity asks questions. Regret carries emotion. And emotion changes everything. Because once regret enters the picture, the relationship is no longer being viewed through the same lens. He's measuring his choices against your growth. And that comparison can be difficult to live with. Especially when your happiness continues growing. Especially when your peace continues deepening. Especially when it becomes obvious that your future no longer depends on his presence. That realization creates a turning point. A major turning point. Because eventually, regret leads to one unavoidable conclusion. You may not be coming back emotionally. Not because you're angry. Not because you're trying to prove a point. Not because you're playing games. But because you've genuinely moved forward. And when that realization finally sinks in, the emotional impact becomes impossible to ignore. Because seeing your growth is one thing. Accepting that you're no longer waiting is something else entirely. And that is where the next stage begins. The stage where reality becomes undeniable. The stage where he realizes that the woman he once knew is no longer standing at the same emotional doorway. And that realization changes everything. There is a huge difference between seeing someone move on and accepting that they have moved on. Most people don't realize that. At first, a man may notice the signs. He may see your growth. He may notice your peace. He may recognize the changes in your life. But somewhere in the back of his mind, a small part of him still believes something. He still believes there is time. Time to figure things out. Time to reach out. Time to think about it later. Time to decide what he really wants. Time to revisit the situation if he ever chooses to. That belief is comforting, because as long as the possibility exists, there is no urgency, no pressure, no need to fully confront reality. But eventually something happens. The possibility begins to disappear, not because you announce it, not because you make a speech, not because you try to prove anything. Simply because your actions become impossible to misunderstand. You continue living. You continue growing. You continue healing. You continue building a life that no longer revolves around the past. And one day, it finally clicks. Not intellectually, emotionally. There is a difference. People can understand something logically for a long time before they actually feel it. This is the stage where he feels it. The stage where reality stops being an idea and becomes an experience. The realization sounds simple, but it carries enormous emotional weight. The realization is, she isn't waiting anymore. For months, maybe even longer, a part of him may have assumed that your feelings remained frozen, that deep down you were still emotionally connected to the same chapter. But now that belief begins to collapse. And when it collapses, something important happens. He starts seeing your growth differently. Before, your growth was interesting. Now, your growth feels final. Before, your peace was surprising. Now, your peace feels permanent. Before, your independence was noticeable. Now, your independence feels real. And that changes everything. Because for the first time, he understands what moving on actually means. It doesn't mean you stopped caring overnight. It doesn't mean the relationship never mattered. It doesn't mean you forgot everything. It means you chose to continue living. You chose to keep growing. You chose to keep moving forward. And now the results of that choice are visible. The emotional door he once assumed would remain open forever no longer looks the same. And that realization can be surprisingly powerful. Because human beings often underestimate permanence until they encounter it. As long as something feels temporary, it remains emotionally manageable. But once it feels permanent, the emotional impact becomes much stronger. That is exactly what happens here. The reality of your emotional absence begins feeling permanent, and permanence forces honesty. The excuses become weaker, the assumptions become weaker, the comfort of maybe later becomes weaker. Because now there is a growing awareness that later may not exist. The future is changing. You are changing. Life is changing. And those changes are happening whether he is ready or not. This realization often creates an emotional heaviness. Not necessarily sadness, not necessarily heartbreak. Something more complex. A mixture of loss, reflection, acceptance, and uncertainty. Because once he realizes you are no longer waiting, a new question appears. A question he spent a long time avoiding. The question is, what happens if she never comes back? That question carries weight, because it forces him to imagine a future without possibilities. Not a future without memories. Not a future without respect. A future without another chance. And that's when many men begin looking at the relationship through an entirely different lens. The arguments become smaller. The frustrations become smaller. The inconveniences become smaller. And the meaningful moments become larger. Much larger. Because perspective changes when permanence enters the picture. People often focus on what bothered them when something is available, but they focus on what they valued when something is gone. That's human nature, and during this stage, value becomes impossible to ignore. The value of your presence, the value of your support, the value of your loyalty, the value of your understanding, the value of simply having you in his life. These realizations don't necessarily arrive all at once. They arrive piece by piece, memory by memory, moment by moment, but eventually they create a bigger picture. A picture that becomes harder to deny. The picture is simple. You mattered, deeply, more than he realized, more than he admitted, perhaps more than he understood at the time. And now that understanding arrives when things have already changed. That timing can be painful, because awareness often comes after opportunity, not before. And that's what makes this stage so emotional, not because he suddenly becomes a different person, but because he is finally seeing the situation clearly, sometimes clearer than ever before. The woman he once knew is not standing still. She is building a life, creating new memories, developing new strengths, discovering new happiness. And the farther she moves into that future, the more distant the old version becomes. That reality cannot be argued with. It cannot be negotiated. It cannot be explained away. It simply exists. And once reality reaches that point, another emotion begins emerging. A deeper emotion. An emotion many people try hard to hide. Because this is the stage where the protective walls begin breaking down. The stage where pride becomes weaker. The stage where emotional truth becomes harder to avoid. The stage where he starts feeling the full weight of what your absence actually means. And when that happens, the emotions become much harder to hide, even from himself. Because after reality fully sinks in, the next thing he faces is not curiosity, not comparison, not even simple regret. It's the emotional impact of loss itself. And that impact changes everything. This is the stage that almost nobody sees. Not because it doesn't happen, but because it usually happens in private, far away from social media, far away from friends, far away from public conversations. Because when people talk about emotional pain, they often imagine dramatic scenes, tears, phone calls, emotional messages, big confessions, but real emotional pain is often much quieter than that. Sometimes it happens while sitting alone. Sometimes it happens during a normal day. Sometimes it happens in the middle of an ordinary moment. A moment that suddenly doesn't feel ordinary anymore. Because by this point, the reality of your absence has settled in. The curiosity has happened. The comparisons have happened. The regret has happened. The realization that you are no longer waiting has happened. And now he is left with something he can no longer avoid. The truth. The truth that your life is continuing. The truth that you are genuinely moving forward. The truth that the emotional connection he once took comfort in may no longer belong to him. That truth can be surprisingly heavy. Because for a long time, part of him believed there would always be another opportunity, another conversation, another chance, another opening. But now those assumptions feel uncertain, and uncertainty creates vulnerability. This is where many men experience something they never expected. They begin grieving. Not necessarily grieving the relationship alone, grieving the future they imagined, the plans they once discussed, the possibilities that once felt real, the version of life they assumed would always be available. Because when a person matters deeply, losing them affects more than the present. It affects the future too. And that future is what often hurts the most. The future birthday that will never happen the same way. The future trip that never happened. The future conversations that never took place. The future memories that were never created. All those possibilities suddenly feel real. And that's when the emotional impact becomes difficult to ignore. For some men, this stage arrives suddenly. For others, it arrives gradually. But when it arrives, it often brings a surprising amount of emotion. Not because they are weak, not because they are broken, but because they are human, and human beings feel loss, especially when they finally understand what was lost. This is often the point where memories become more emotional. A song carries more meaning. A photograph carries more meaning. A familiar place carries more meaning. A simple memory suddenly feels heavier than before. Because now those memories are no longer competing with denial. They are no longer competing with ego. They are no longer competing with assumptions. Now they stand alone. And when they stand alone, their emotional weight becomes easier to feel. That is why many men become unexpectedly emotional during this stage. Even if nobody knows, even if they never talk about it, even if they continue appearing perfectly fine on the outside. Inside, something is changing. The walls that protected them are becoming weaker. The certainty they once relied on is disappearing. And the emotional reality is becoming clearer. You mattered. Your presence mattered. Your love mattered. Your support mattered. And now your absence matters too. That realization is often painful, because awareness comes with responsibility. Awareness means seeing things clearly. Awareness means recognizing what was overlooked. Awareness means understanding value after it is gone. And understanding value after loss can be one of the hardest emotional experiences a person faces. Especially when the other person is healing. Especially when the other person is thriving. Especially when the other person appears genuinely at peace. Because your peace sends a message. Not through words. Not through explanations. Not through anything you say. Through your actions. The message is, my life did not end here. And while that message is beautiful for you, it can be emotional for someone who is only now understanding what they lost. Because every sign of your happiness confirms the same reality. You are building something new. You are creating new chapters. You are discovering new possibilities. And those possibilities may no longer include him. That realization often creates a moment of emotional honesty. A rare moment. A private moment. A moment where he stops arguing with reality. Stops making excuses. Stops pretending not to care. Stops telling himself the same stories. And simply admits the truth. The truth might sound different for every man, but it often resembles something like this. I miss her. I underestimated her. I didn't fully appreciate her. I thought there would always be more time. I didn't realize how much she meant to me. These thoughts are difficult because they arrive after perspective has changed. Perspective has a way of making certain truths impossible to ignore. And once those truths become visible, they tend to stay visible. That is why this stage feels so heavy. Not because it is dramatic, but because it is honest. For perhaps the first time since the breakup, emotional honesty becomes stronger than emotional protection. And emotional honesty changes everything. Because once a person fully acknowledges their feelings, action often becomes the next question. Not always action toward reconciliation, not always action toward communication, but action of some kind. The mind naturally wants resolution. It wants closure. It wants understanding. It wants to know whether anything can still be done. And that is exactly where the next stage begins. Because after the emotional truth finally surfaces, a new thought begins appearing. A thought that becomes harder to ignore every day. The thought is simple, but powerful. What if I reached out? And that question marks the beginning of a completely new chapter. A chapter where emotions are no longer hidden. A chapter where decisions become unavoidable. A chapter where he must decide whether to remain silent or finally make contact. There comes a moment when thinking is no longer enough. A moment when curiosity, comparison, reflection, and regret have all run their course. A moment when the mind keeps arriving at the same place over and over again. You, not the version of you from the breakup, not the version of you who was hurting, not the version of you who was waiting, the version of you who has moved forward, the version of you who found peace, the version of you who kept growing. And strangely enough, that version is often the one that becomes hardest to forget. Because now, he sees something he didn't see before. Your strength. Not loud strength. Not angry strength. Not strength designed to prove a point. Quiet strength. The kind of strength that rebuilds a life without needing applause. The kind of strength that heals without making announcements. The kind of strength that keeps moving forward, even when nobody is watching. And seeing that strength changes the emotional equation. Because it forces him to acknowledge something important. You didn't just survive the ending. You transformed because of it. And transformation is powerful. It makes people stop and look again. It makes people reassess. It makes people wonder. And that's exactly what is happening now. For weeks or months, he has been observing from a distance, thinking, reflecting, questioning, remembering. But eventually a question starts appearing more frequently than all the others. A question he cannot easily ignore. What if I talk to her? At first, the thought is brief, just a passing idea. Then it comes back, again and again and again, until eventually it becomes difficult to dismiss. Because the human mind naturally seeks resolution. When something feels unfinished, people often feel drawn toward clarity, toward answers, toward conversation, toward understanding. And by this stage, many men begin wondering whether silence is giving them peace or preventing it. That's an important distinction. Earlier, silence felt comfortable. Silence protected the ego. Silence avoided vulnerability. Silence postponed difficult emotions. But now, silence begins feeling different. Now silence means unanswered questions. Now silence means uncertainty. Now silence means wondering what could have happened. And wondering can become exhausting, especially when the questions keep returning. Questions like, would she even respond? How would she feel if I reached out? Has too much time passed? Would she want to hear from me? Is she completely over me? Notice how these questions reveal something important. The certainty is gone. Earlier he assumed he knew where he stood. Now he isn't sure. And uncertainty creates vulnerability. For perhaps the first time, he begins experiencing the same uncertainty you may have experienced long ago. The uncertainty of not knowing. The uncertainty of caring without having answers. That emotional shift is significant, because empathy often grows when people experience what someone else once felt. He begins understanding how difficult uncertainty can be, how uncomfortable unanswered questions can be, how heavy emotional distance can feel. And that understanding often deepens his appreciation for what you once gave, your patience, your effort, your consistency, your willingness to communicate. Things he may not have fully understood before now look different, much different. This is why many men begin seriously considering contact during this stage, not necessarily because they have all the answers, not necessarily because they have a perfect plan, but because the emotional reality has become too significant to ignore. The feelings have become too clear, the absence has become too noticeable, the questions have become too persistent, and eventually, the possibility of reaching out begins feeling less intimidating than the possibility of remaining silent forever. That doesn't mean every man reaches out. Some do, some don't. People are different, situations are different, personalities are different. But the internal debate is often remarkably similar. One side says, leave it alone. The other side says, what if this is the last chance? One side says, move on. The other side says, what if she was truly special? One side says, stay silent. The other side says, what if silence becomes the biggest regret? And that final question can be powerful, because regret is often easier to carry when people believe there was nothing they could do. But when people believe they still have a choice, regret feels different, heavier, more personal, more difficult to ignore. That is why many men spend a long time wrestling with this stage. They replay conversations. They imagine possible outcomes. They think about what they would say. They think about what might happen. They think about whether the door is closed. And all the while, your peaceful moving on continues sending the same message. Life goes on. That message creates urgency, not dramatic urgency, quiet urgency. The awareness that time keeps moving. The awareness that people keep changing. The awareness that opportunities evolve. And the awareness that waiting forever is not actually an option. Eventually, one realization becomes impossible to avoid. Whether he reaches out or not, whether he returns or not, whether another conversation ever happens or not, you have changed. You are no longer the same woman from the beginning of this story. You have grown. You have healed. You have become stronger. And that growth has altered everything, including how he sees you, including how he sees himself, including how he sees the past. That realization leads directly into the final chapter, the chapter that matters more than all the others. Because in the end, his story isn't really about whether he comes back. It's about what your peaceful moving on truly accomplished, and why, regardless of what he chooses to do next. If you've stayed with me this far, there is one final truth we need to talk about. A truth that often gets lost in conversations about breakups, moving on, and relationships. Because many people spend months asking one question: will he come back? It's understandable. When someone mattered deeply, that question can feel important. You replay memories, you wonder what they're thinking, you wonder whether they miss you, you wonder whether they regret what happened, you wonder whether they'll eventually reach out. But after everything we've discussed, there's something even more important than that question. Something bigger, something that changes the entire perspective. The truth is this: the greatest victory was never getting him back. The greatest victory was getting yourself back. Think about that for a moment. At the beginning of this journey, you were focused on the loss, the ending, the heartbreak, the disappointment, the uncertainty. Everything felt connected to what had happened. Everything felt connected to him. But look at where you are now. You survived the days you thought you wouldn't survive. You got through the nights that felt endless. You carried yourself through moments nobody saw. You rebuilt parts of yourself that had been shaken. You learned lessons. You developed strength. You found peace. And most importantly, you kept moving. That is the real story, not whether he came back, not whether he sent a message, not whether he regrets losing you. Those things may matter, but they are not the most important part. The most important part is who you became. Because heartbreak changes people. The question is not whether it changes them. The question is how. Some people allow heartbreak to convince them they are powerless. Others use heartbreak as a turning point toward growth, toward healing, toward self-respect, toward a deeper understanding of their own worth. You chose the second path, and that's why you've already won. Not because winning means someone loses, not because winning means revenge, not because winning means making someone suffer. Real winning looks different. Real winning is waking up one day and realizing your happiness no longer depends on someone's decision. Real winning is finding peace that doesn't require validation. Real winning is creating a life that feels meaningful, regardless of who stays and who leaves. That is what your peaceful moving on accomplished. And ironically, that's often the very thing that affects people the most. Because genuine peace cannot be faked forever. People recognize it, they feel it, they see it, not through words, but through energy, through confidence, through consistency, through the way you carry yourself. That's why your peaceful moving on had such a profound impact, not because it was designed to affect him, but because it reflected something real, growth. And growth is impossible to ignore, especially when it comes from someone who once felt broken. Throughout this story, we've talked about what he might feel: the shock, the confusion, the curiosity, the comparison, the regret, the realization, the emotional weight of seeing you move forward. All of those things matter, but they are still secondary to the most important transformation, your transformation. Because while he was trying to understand your growth, you were busy living it. While he was wondering whether you had changed, you were changing. While he was questioning the past, you were building a future. And that's the part many people overlook, the future. Because life is not meant to be lived looking permanently in the rearview mirror. The past can teach you. The past can shape you. The past can strengthen you. But the future is where life actually happens. And your peaceful moving on is proof that you understand that. You chose not to remain trapped in old chapters. You chose not to allow heartbreak to define your entire story. You chose to keep turning pages. And that choice changed everything. Maybe he comes back, maybe he doesn't. Maybe he reaches out, maybe he never does. Maybe he regrets losing you, maybe he spends years reflecting on what happened. The truth is, none of those outcomes determine your value. They never did. Your value was never created by his attention. Your value was never created by his approval. Your value was never created by his decision to stay or leave. Your value existed long before the relationship, and it continues long after it. That is the lesson so many people eventually discover. And when they do, something incredible happens. They stop chasing closure from other people, because they create closure within themselves. They stop waiting for someone else's actions to bring them peace, because they learn how to build peace independently. And once that happens, life changes. Not instantly, not perfectly, but meaningfully, because freedom begins where dependency ends. And your peaceful moving on was never just about leaving the past behind. It was about finding yourself again. That is why you've already won. Not because someone misses you, not because someone regrets losing you, not because someone realizes your value too late, but because you realized your value in time. And that realization is worth more than any text message, more than any apology, more than any comeback story. Because at the end of the day, the most powerful thing a person can do after heartbreak is not make someone else see their worth. It's seeing their own worth. And once you do that, everything changes.